A racist cop assaulted a black woman in public, gripping her by the neck without ever imagining she was a U.S. Navy SEAL, and what she did next left everyone stunned, as the same man who tried to strip her of her dignity found himself begging for forgiveness just minutes later. It happened in broad daylight, under the clear sky of a peaceful protest held in honor of George Floyd's memory. People marched, chanted, and held up signs that read, "Justice. Equality. Dignity." But in the middle of that crowd stood a woman, quiet, focused, proud, not holding a sign, not chanting, just being present. Strong. Calm. Seen. And yet, not seen. Not for who she really was. She wasn't wearing a uniform that day. She wasn't there as a soldier or a symbol. She was there as a citizen. As a sister. As a voice. And that, to some, was threatening enough. That's when the patrol unit pulled up. Lights flashing, engine purring like a predator circling its prey. 2 officers stepped out. One walked with caution. The other, the one who started it all, moved like he'd already made up his mind. He scanned the crowd, looked past dozens of faces, and landed his eyes on her. Not because she was doing anything wrong. Not because she posed any danger. But because something about her, her stillness, her presence, her silence, irritated him. He didn't like it. He didn't understand it. And he needed to control it. "Step back," he shouted, pushing through the marchers, zeroing in on her like she had a target painted on her chest. She didn't flinch. She didn't run. She didn't even blink. That only fueled him more. "What's in the bag?" he asked, gesturing to her backpack with a smirk, the kind of smirk that says I already know what I want this to be. She replied, calm and firm, "My medical kit. I'm trained." That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. He looked at her with disgust. Trained? In what? Street fights? He stepped closer. She repeated, firmer now, "Step back. You're out of line." And that was it. The moment. The trigger. The unraveling. In one swift move, he grabbed her by the neck and shoved her against a wooden banner pole, knocking over candles, signs, and dignity in one single motion. The air shifted. The protest fell silent. Cell phones went up. And so did her chin. Even while his hand gripped her throat, she didn't look down. She looked into him, cold, unshaken, defiant. People began yelling. "Let her go. You're choking her." But he didn't flinch. Instead, he hissed, "You think I won't arrest you right now? You think being loud makes you right?" She managed to speak, her voice rasping but razor sharp, "You don't know who I am, and you just made the worst mistake of your life." He scoffed. "Lady, all I see is a thug with attitude." And that was the moment the universe shifted, because that wasn't just ignorance. That was dismissal. That was centuries of power being abused, rolled into one ignorant sentence. But what he didn't know was that the woman he tried to reduce, humiliate, silence, had been forged in some of the most brutal military training on earth. She had served in silence. Fought for freedoms he took for granted. Protected men like him. Buried friends for this country. And today? She stood in her own land, being violated by the very uniform she once wore with pride. She didn't strike him. She didn't scream. She didn't need to. Because every camera in that plaza had caught it all, the aggression, the choking, the words. And the moment she identified herself, the energy in the air shifted. The other officer turned pale. Onlookers gasped. Some even dropped their phones from the shock. This wasn't just some woman at a protest. This was a highly trained Navy SEAL. A decorated soldier. And she wasn't just going to walk away quietly. In less than 2 minutes, everything turned. A legal team formed around her almost instantly. A high-ranking commander she once served with made a phone call. Within the hour, news outlets got a tip. That night, her photo was everywhere, not from war zones, but from a protest where she was the one under siege. Headlines read, "Black Navy SEAL assaulted at peaceful protest by officer," and, "When heroes are targeted at home." The officer? He didn't sleep that night. Because by dawn, everything he built began to collapse. An internal investigation was launched. Old complaints resurfaced. Testimonies came forward. His career, his image, his power, everything crumbled before sunrise. But it didn't stop there. What she did next wasn't about vengeance. It was about principle. Dignity. Truth. She could have crushed him with the same force he used on her. But instead, she chose something far more devastating. A calculated, tactical, lawful move that would change the course of his life, and maybe, the department's. In a single courtroom moment, a room full of officers were forced to listen to her speak. She wore a navy pin on her chest and looked that man straight in the eyes as he sat, broken, jobless, humiliated, and under oath. He had no words left. Only shame. And regret. And a question that lingered long after the gavel hit the desk: what if I had known who she was? But that was the point. He shouldn't have needed to know her rank to respect her. She shouldn't have needed to wear a uniform to be treated like a human being. And yet, here they were. Another chapter in a long history of injustice, but this one, finally, with a twist. What she did with that power, how she used it, and the final blow she delivered, was something no one saw coming. Not even him. But the real question is, how did she turn the world against a man who thought it would always protect him, and what final move made even the judge gasp in disbelief? Stay until the end, because what she did next will leave you questioning everything you thought justice looked like. Before we begin this story, we want to speak directly to our black viewers. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism, prejudice, or discrimination. Your lives, your voices, and your stories matter. This channel is a space where truth meets justice, and where no one is silenced. Stay strong. Stay proud. And remember, we see you. Now, get ready for a powerful journey. If you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button and join us for stories that twist, shake, and inspire. Enjoy the story. The summer air in Richmond, Virginia, had a certain heaviness that year, not just from the thick humidity clinging to every surface, but from something deeper, something heavier, something unspoken. Tensions in the city had been simmering just beneath the surface for months. Protests flared and cooled like waves, but the undercurrent of frustration never quite subsided. People walked the streets with tired eyes, caught between the memory of names lost to injustice and the hope that speaking them out loud might still mean something. In the midst of this slow-burning unrest lived a woman named Ayanna Carter, whose presence alone seemed to shift the atmosphere around her, not because of how she looked, but because of the way she carried everything she'd been through like a second spine. Ayanna had returned to Richmond after nearly a decade away. 10 years of service as a U.S. Navy SEAL had shaped her body, her discipline, and her silence. She didn't wear medals. She didn't talk about what she'd seen or done overseas. But those close to her noticed the way she walked, calculated, present, never rushed. They noticed how she never sat with her back to a door. How her eyes scanned a room before she spoke. Her silence was not a void, it was a presence. Full of memories she would never offer freely. She lived in a modest brownstone near the east side, close enough to the protests to hear the chants on her front porch, far enough to sleep without sirens every night. To the neighborhood kids, she was Miss Carter, the quiet woman who gave out water bottles and Band-Aids on hot afternoons. To the local gym owners, she was that crazy strong chick who doesn't say much but lifts like a machine. To the older women at the barbershop, she was that sweet girl who helps her aunt with groceries. And to the Richmond Police Department, she was a complete unknown, until the day they forced her into the spotlight she never asked for. Before all that, though, Ayana was trying. Trying to live a civilian life. Trying to learn how to slow down after years of high-alert missions, of foreign soil and hostile terrain. She was enrolled in a trauma recovery program for veterans. She was training in holistic medicine, taking quiet steps toward a career in field support and crisis counseling. She had recently become a certified responder for medical emergencies at public events, the kind of work she hoped might bring peace where bullets once lived. Her daily life had become a quiet routine: early morning jogs before the city woke up, black coffee with no sugar, 2 boiled eggs, and a short call to her Aunt Noreen, who lived 4 blocks away and always made sure Ayana didn't forget she was still human. But the truth was, Ayana hadn't forgotten. In fact, she remembered too much. Faces. Names. Screams that didn't fade with time. What she struggled with was trust. Trusting civilians. Trusting law enforcement. Trusting the system she once believed she was protecting. And perhaps, more than anything, trusting that silence could still be safe. Her story was layered in pain and perseverance. Born and raised in Richmond, she had seen the city change, grow, burn, and rebuild. She had lost a cousin to a wrongful arrest when she was 16. That same year, she'd watched her older brother be stopped and frisked on their way to school for no reason other than wearing a hoodie. These moments branded her early life with a fire that never died, and though it was that fire that fueled her decision to enlist, it was also what made her return so complicated. She had left to fight battles she could name. Coming home meant facing ghosts she had no words for. The protest scheduled that week had been a grassroots call from local organizations demanding the reopening of 2 cold cases involving police misconduct. It wasn't national news. It wasn't flashy. It was community-led, raw, and necessary. Ayana wasn't planning to attend at first. She preferred her support behind the scenes, organizing supplies, checking on injured marchers, offering medical aid when needed. But that morning, something pushed her to go. Maybe it was the image of a mother crying on TV. Maybe it was her aunt's voice on the phone saying, "We need people who've seen the world, who know better." Or maybe, just maybe, it was the part of her that was tired of being invisible, of watching from the sidelines while the city that raised her screamed for air. She didn't wear anything flashy. Black tactical pants. Simple t-shirt. Braids tied back. Her small navy medical pack across her chest. She arrived early, walked the perimeter, memorized the escape routes without even realizing she was doing it. It was instinct. By the time the protest began to grow in numbers, Ayana had already helped 3 people set up hydration stations, wrapped a twisted ankle for a young girl, and nodded respectfully to a few volunteers who clearly didn't recognize her but appreciated the help. Across the plaza, Officer Mark Delaney leaned against his squad car like he owned the city block. To many, he was a veteran officer with 15 years on the force and a thick file of commendations. To others, particularly those who knew what it felt like to be followed through a store or questioned for walking too slowly, he was trouble in a badge. Mark had a look about him, the kind that scanned people instead of streets. The kind that made people cross to the other side not for safety, but for self-preservation. He was sharp-tongued, impatient, and deeply uncomfortable when not in control. And nothing made him feel more out of control than a protest. Especially a protest full of black and brown faces demanding change. He had heard the usual warnings from his captain that morning: stay back unless there's a call. Keep it professional. But Mark didn't operate on warnings. He operated on instinct, and his instincts were twisted by years of unchecked authority. So when he noticed a tall black woman moving with precision, not chanting, not holding a sign, just watching, something in him bristled. He didn't recognize her, and that bothered him. She didn't look afraid. That bothered him more. As she moved through the crowd offering medical assistance, checking vitals with calm ease, Mark's eyes stayed on her like a hawk to prey. It wasn't what she was doing. It was how she was doing it. With authority. With grace. Without fear. To Mark, that wasn't presence, that was provocation. What happened next wouldn't be remembered for its noise, but for its weight. Ayanna knelt to check on an older man who had collapsed under the heat, her fingers on his pulse, her voice calm and steady. She didn't notice the approaching footsteps until they were inches from her. Mark's voice cut through the air with unnecessary volume. "Hey! Step away from him. You don't have clearance." Ayanna didn't move. "I'm certified," she said, without turning. "He's dehydrated. I've got it." But that wasn't the response Mark wanted. He wanted compliance. Fear. Submission. When she stood and faced him, he saw none of those things. Just control. Confidence. Something he couldn't stand. He took a step forward. Too close. Too fast. She backed up slightly, but her voice remained firm. "You're in my space, officer." He replied with a snort. "You think wearing a backpack and acting tough makes you somebody?" Ayanna didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than anything he'd ever yelled. And in that silence, he acted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was calculated and cruel. A sudden grab at her neck. A shove. A public display of dominance disguised as law enforcement. The crowd reacted slowly at first, unsure if it was part of something bigger. But as gasps rose, so did phones. So did voices. So did the truth. And as Ayanna hit the wooden pole behind her, the medical bag bouncing against her ribs, her breath caught, not from the impact, but from the weight of the moment. Not because it hurt. But because it confirmed everything she feared about coming home. What Mark didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the woman standing in front of him had already survived battles more brutal than anything he could imagine. And what was coming next wasn't revenge. It was reckoning. But that reckoning would come later. First came the silence. The shock. The disbelief that in 2025, a decorated Navy SEAL could be publicly assaulted by the very institution she once bled for. And all she could think, in those first few seconds on the ground, was, "They still don't see us. Even when we fight their wars." What happened after that, well, the world would talk about it for months. And you? You're about to find out why. The crowd didn't move at first. That was the most haunting part, the stillness that followed the assault, as if reality itself had frozen. Some people gasped, a few shouted, but most stood there suspended between shock and disbelief, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Ayanna had been shoved, handled, and humiliated, not behind closed doors, not in a gray zone of ambiguity, but in plain sight, in the middle of a peaceful protest surrounded by cameras, witnesses, and the very community she came to serve. She rose slowly, not because she was injured, but because she was measuring every fiber of discipline it took to not retaliate. Her training screamed at her to assess, adapt, respond, but in this moment, her humanity hurt more than any combat wound she'd ever received. Officer Delaney, still caught in the echo of his own power move, took a step back as voices rose around him. People shouted things he was used to hearing, "Get your hands off her, that's assault, she didn't do anything." But something was different this time. The woman he had just grabbed wasn't yelling back. She wasn't swinging or resisting. She was staring through him with a silence that felt louder than any accusation. And for the first time in a very long time, Mark felt the cold twinge of doubt creeping up his spine. Ayanna turned to the nearest protester, a young woman with a phone still shaking in her hand. Her voice was steady but sharp. "Did you get it all?" The girl nodded. Ayanna gave one more glance toward Delaney, then picked up her medical bag and walked away without a word. The silence in her departure cut deeper than any argument could have. What followed was a series of moments that bled into each other like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Within hours, the footage had made its way to social media. It spread like wildfire, not because the internet hadn't seen worse, but because this time, the story came with layers. A respected veteran. A peaceful protest. A man in uniform abusing authority not out of fear, but out of ego. And suddenly, this wasn't just about Ayanna. It was about everyone who had ever been mishandled, misunderstood, mistreated, and mislabeled. Ayanna spent the evening at her aunt's house, sitting on the edge of the porch as crickets filled the silence that neither of them could quite break. Noreen handed her a glass of water and sat beside her, her eyes heavy with the kind of pain only black women know, the pain of watching someone you love get stripped down by a world that refuses to see their full worth. "You okay?" Noreen asked gently. Ayanna nodded, but the tension in her jaw said otherwise. "I didn't react," Ayanna finally said, her voice low. "I wanted to, every part of me did, but I didn't. I held it." Noreen placed a hand over hers. "You did more than hold it. You exposed it. That man's days of hiding behind that badge are numbered. Trust me." The next morning, the Richmond Police Department issued a lukewarm statement, something about reviewing the footage and pending investigation. It wasn't enough. Not for the city. Not for the community. And definitely not for Ayanna. She had faced insurgents in war zones, survived ambushes, led rescue missions under gunfire. But this? Being choked in her own country for trying to save a man's life. This was betrayal layered on top of insult, and it couldn't go unanswered. Over the next few days, a quiet storm began to build. Ayanna didn't speak to the press. She didn't post on social media. She moved quietly, intentionally, reaching out to legal contacts, military networks, and people she had saved in the past, those who owed their lives to her. Support began to swell, not in headlines, but behind the scenes. Lawyers. Activists. Officers who respected her. Even former commanders. One by one, voices began to rise, not just in outrage, but in defense. Meanwhile, Delaney was feeling the ground shift beneath his feet. The department was suddenly distant. His captain called him into the office and closed the door with a heavy sigh. "Mark, we need to talk." The conversation was short, clipped, full of terms like procedure and public image. He tried to defend himself, saying she was acting suspicious, that he was responding to a perceived threat, but the captain's expression didn't change. "You put your hands on a civilian medic at a peaceful protest," he said flatly. "And now we're in deep. Real deep." Mark walked out of that meeting with a knot in his stomach and a growing fear he didn't know how to name. For the first time, he was realizing that this wouldn't just disappear. That maybe, this woman, whoever she was, had more power than he expected. Across town, Ayanna met with her legal team in a quiet office above a black-owned bookstore. The walls were lined with books about justice, civil rights, military strategy. She sat at the head of the table, not in uniform, not in any official capacity, but everyone in the room deferred to her like a commander. A young lawyer, Jamal, laid out the plan. "We'll go for a civil suit first. Use the footage. Hit them where it hurts. But the real play is what happens after. Your name, your record, we can get national attention. We can expose systemic abuse, not just this one guy." Ayanna nodded, but her eyes were distant. "I don't want revenge," she said. "I want accountability. I want this to mean something." Jamal leaned forward. "Then we do it right. We make it impossible for them to pretend this never happened." As preparations began, more stories surfaced. People who had been harassed by Delaney came forward. One man remembered being pulled over and questioned for an hour because of a taillight. Another recounted being followed through a grocery store for acting nervous. Patterns emerged. And suddenly, the story wasn't just about Ayanna. It was about the culture that allowed someone like Delaney to thrive for 15 years without consequences. Back at the precinct, Delaney's locker was quietly emptied. Not by him, but by request. He was placed on leave, pending investigation, and just like that, his authority, once absolute, once unquestioned, began to unravel. He avoided the news. Avoided his colleagues. But he couldn't avoid the guilt. And Ayanna? She remained quiet. Focused. Intentional. But beneath that calm exterior, something was building. Not rage. Not even sorrow. It was something colder. Sharper. A clarity that comes only when you realize your silence will no longer protect you. One night, as she stood looking over the river walk, a stranger approached her. A middle-aged man in a veteran's cap. He looked nervous. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I just wanted to thank you. I saw the video. And thank you for standing tall. For showing them what dignity really looks like." Ayanna smiled faintly. "It's not about me," she replied. "It's about making sure they never do it again." And he nodded, because he understood. But something still lingered in the air. Something that hadn't surfaced yet. Something that would change everything once it did. Because while the city prepared for legal battles and public hearings, while the press built their narratives and the department scrambled for damage control, Ayanna was preparing for something else. Something that couldn't be ignored. Something that would shake the foundation of everything they thought they knew. Something that, once revealed, would silence every room she entered. But that's the thing about stories like this. They never end where you think they will. And what Ayanna was about to do, would change more than just one man's fate. It would flip the entire system on its head. And no one, not even her closest allies, was ready for what she had planned. The courthouse was colder than expected, not in temperature but in presence. Marble walls, sterile white light, and the buzz of tension disguised as order filled every inch of the space. Outside, crowds had gathered, activists, veterans, students, journalists, and quiet onlookers holding signs not for the cameras but for each other. Inside, the echo of footsteps and whispers bounced off the high ceilings like secrets refusing to stay quiet. Ayanna sat at the front of the courtroom beside her attorney, her posture still, her gaze unwavering, her breathing even. She wore a navy blue blazer with a single ribbon pinned to the left side, not a statement, just a reminder. The woman who had once served in silence was now being heard not through a rifle or a report, but through the very system that had tried to silence her. Across the room sat Mark Delaney, no longer in uniform. His suit didn't quite fit right, the collar stiff against his throat, the sleeves clumsy at his wrists. He looked older than he had weeks ago. Not physically, but in the way a man ages when the mirror no longer reflects the man he thought he was. His lawyer sat beside him, stone-faced, flipping through documents as if they could somehow change what everyone in the courtroom had already seen. Delaney's hands were clasped tight in his lap, and his knee bounced slightly, a rhythm of regret or anticipation, even he didn't know. When Ayanna stood to testify, the room leaned into her silence. No gavel. No interruptions. Just her voice, steady and sharp, each word cut with clarity. She spoke of the day without dramatics. She didn't need to embellish. The footage had done that work already. She focused on her role, her responsibility, her restraint. She explained how protocol was broken, how trust was shattered, and how a uniform, when wielded without respect, becomes a weapon. Then came the moment no one saw coming. Ayanna's attorney cleared his throat and asked to submit additional evidence, not just footage, not just testimonials, but a document that would shift the room's axis. It was a detailed record from the Department of the Navy and the Department of Justice, confirming that, for the past 4 months prior to the incident, Ayanna Carter had been working in quiet partnership with a federal initiative to train and consult on police reform strategies across high-risk municipalities, including Richmond. She wasn't just a veteran. She was a federal advisor embedded in community environments, assessing field behavior, reviewing use of force patterns, and, most shockingly, identifying officers with repeat complaints that had slipped through internal reviews. Her presence at that protest wasn't coincidence. It was assignment. She had been evaluating Richmond's department long before the incident. And Mark Delaney, with his closed-door file full of complaints and unchecked aggression, had been flagged. Ayana's voice was calm, but the fire underneath it was undeniable. I was there doing my job. The same way I've done it in war zones. The same way I've done it in cities across this country. And I didn't come here today for revenge. I came here to expose the truth. A wave of murmurs filled the courtroom. Delaney's face drained of color. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but it was too late. The shock had landed. For all his bravado, all his bluster, Delaney had attacked a federal advisor mid-assignment. On camera. Surrounded by witnesses. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had detonated his own future. Judge Millstone leaned forward, her expression unreadable. Ms. Carter, are you saying that your presence at the protest was under federal directive? Ayana nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I was embedded in the community for active assessment, and the incident in question provided irrefutable confirmation of internal failures. The judge exhaled, slow and deliberate. And did the department know of your status? Ayana looked directly at Delaney. They were informed weeks prior. I was listed under a classified ID, as is standard procedure for unbiased observation. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Then Delaney stood. He wasn't supposed to. His attorney motioned for him to sit, but something inside him cracked wide open. He looked at Ayana with a mix of anger, fear, and something more pathetic, disbelief. His voice shook as he spoke. You set me up, he said, barely above a whisper. You let me hang myself out there like a damn fool. Ayana didn't flinch. Her voice was colder than it had ever been. You did that on your own. He took a step forward, and security guards instinctively moved, but the judge raised a hand to keep order. Delaney stopped. His shoulders dropped, his confidence gone, and for the first time, his voice sounded like a man who realized the ground beneath him was no longer his. I didn't know, he said, like it excused everything. Ayana answered with the words that would echo far beyond that courtroom. You shouldn't have needed to know who I was to treat me with respect. A breathless hush settled over the room. A moment of truth so sharp, it cut through every excuse, every defense, every line of institutional protection that had allowed men like Delaney to operate in shadows. Then came the last blow. Ayana's attorney requested one final submission, a recommendation from the federal agency for immediate disciplinary action, not just for Delaney, but for the leadership that failed to address his pattern of behavior. The case was no longer just about one incident, it was a mirror held to an entire system. Judge Millstone reviewed the documents silently, her jaw tightening as she read. Then, with measured calm, she made her ruling. Delaney's actions constituted not only excessive force but also obstruction of a federal assessment. The consequences would be criminal and administrative. He would be dismissed, charged, and barred from ever holding a public service position again. But even that wasn't the final sting. Before the gavel dropped, Ayana turned once more toward him and said, You thought this was just about one woman. It never was. This was about all of us you've silenced, all of us you've bruised, all of us you've walked past like we weren't worth seeing. Today, you looked. And now, the whole country is watching. Delaney sat down, his body folding under the weight of a truth he could no longer ignore. The courtroom began to empty, people whispering, cameras flashing, but Ayana stood still. Her breath steady. Her mission complete. Outside, a crowd waited, uncertain of what had happened inside those walls. As she stepped through the doors, they fell silent, watching her. She didn't raise her fist. She didn't smile. She simply nodded, a small gesture that spoke louder than any speech. Jamal met her on the steps, holding his phone. We're trending nationally, he said. People are calling it the most powerful testimony of the year. Ayana looked out at the horizon, the sun dipping low behind the courthouse, casting long shadows across the steps. Good, she said. Let them talk. But more importantly, let them listen. What came next was no longer in her hands. The truth had been delivered. The system cracked open. And as the world leaned in to hear the sound of justice landing hard and loud, Ayanna walked away with her head held high, her mission complete, but not yet over. Because what she was about to do next would reach even further. The ride back to Ayanna's neighborhood was unusually quiet, not because there was nothing to say, but because the weight of everything that had just unfolded was still settling. The sky was starting to bruise with the colors of dusk, amber light slipping between the buildings like a sigh after a storm. In the back seat of the black sedan, Ayanna sat staring out the window, her posture still upright, her hands resting over her lap. Jamal sat beside her, his phone still buzzing with notifications, articles, interview requests, statements from public figures, but he didn't speak until he noticed the way she hadn't blinked in nearly a minute. He asked her if she was okay, and she turned to him slowly, her voice soft but clear. She said she wasn't sure. Not yet. That she knew what had happened was necessary, important, long overdue, but that didn't mean it didn't hurt. Jamal hesitated before responding, choosing his words with care. He told her she did something people dream of doing their whole lives and never get the chance. That she didn't just win a case, she cracked a wall. But Ayanna shook her head gently and said that the wall was never just about one man or one courtroom. It was about the years she carried silence like armor. About the children watching her now, wondering if it was safe to speak. About the veterans who returned home only to fight a different kind of war, the one on their own streets. When they arrived, the block was lined with quiet supporters. Not chanting, not shouting. Just standing, watching, nodding. Some held candles, some had signs that said "We believe her" or "Justice for Ayanna," but most just stood there in that shared breath of solemn respect. As Ayanna stepped out of the car, people moved back instinctively to give her space. She didn't wave. She didn't perform. She simply walked forward, eyes meeting theirs one by one, acknowledging the quiet strength that held her up. Inside her home, the air smelled like lavender and wood polish. Aunt Noreen had left a pot of tea on the stove, a soft note on the counter in her careful handwriting, "Proud of you. Always." Ayanna read it and felt something tighten in her throat, a knot she hadn't realized she was carrying. She walked into the living room and sat in her favorite chair, the one by the window, the one that faced the street. And then, finally, the weight came crashing down. She didn't cry loud. There was no shaking or wailing. Just a slow, steady stream of tears that carved their way down her cheeks without permission. It wasn't grief. It wasn't regret. It was the release of years of holding things in, of knowing things others didn't, of seeing things others couldn't, of surviving moments that demanded silence when she had every reason to scream. And now that the world had finally seen her, she wasn't sure what to do with all that space. The knock on the door came just before midnight. It was light, hesitant, but persistent. Ayanna stood, wiped her face, and approached the door with caution. She looked through the peephole and paused. On her doorstep, in a plain hoodie and baseball cap pulled low, stood Mark Delaney. For a long moment, she didn't move. Didn't unlock the door. Just stood there, her hand hovering near the handle, staring at the man who had once tried to shrink her into silence. Then, without a word, she turned the lock and opened the door halfway. He looked up, eyes bloodshot, face slack with fatigue. He didn't speak right away. Just stood there, hat in hand, shoulders bent like he had been holding up the world and finally dropped it. She didn't invite him in. She didn't smile. She just waited. He started to speak, stumbled, tried again. He said he knew he had no right. That he didn't expect anything. That he just wanted to say something before the rest of the world made him into someone he no longer recognized. Ayanna crossed her arms, said nothing. Let him speak. He said he watched the footage again and again, not because he needed proof, but because he didn't understand what was wrong with him. He said he kept asking himself how he didn't see her. Not just her title or her mission, but her. As a human being. A citizen. A person trying to help. He said he thought he was doing his job, but maybe his job had become a mask for something uglier, something he hadn't been honest about in a long time. Ayanna interrupted him then, her voice steady. She asked him if he remembered the look in her eyes that day. He said he did. Said it haunted him. She asked him what he saw. He hesitated, then said, "I saw someone who had seen the worst of people, and still stood there with more dignity than I've ever had in my life." She nodded slowly. Then asked him if he understood now that it was never about just one moment. That every decision he made, every person he dismissed, every time he used his badge to assert control instead of offer protection, it was part of something bigger. He said yes. And for the first time, it sounded like he meant it. Then he said the one thing that cracked the air between them. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know if I can. But if there's anything left of me that's worth something, I want it to matter for the right reasons." Ayanna studied him. Long and hard. Then she said that maybe it wasn't about fixing everything. Maybe it was about starting small. About showing up different. About not just listening when the world demands it, but when it doesn't. He nodded. Asked if there was anything he could do. Anything she needed. She looked at him for a long time, then said quietly, "I need you to be quiet now. Not just here. Everywhere. I need you to stop defending yourself and start listening. Start showing up in rooms where people don't look like you and just sit in the discomfort. I need you to look in the mirror every day and ask if the man staring back at you deserves the title of protector. And if the answer's no, then do something about it." He nodded again, eyes wet, voice gone. She closed the door gently. The next morning, Ayanna stood at the steps of City Hall, not in court, not in protest, but in unity. She had been invited to speak at a town-wide community summit on policing and reform. Cameras clicked. Officials flanked her on either side. But she stood alone at the podium, her voice calm, her words deliberate. She told the crowd that justice isn't a moment, it's a muscle. One that has to be worked and stretched and tested, over and over, even when it's painful. She said forgiveness is not erasure. That accountability isn't vengeance. That healing, real healing, starts with truth, even when the truth burns. And in the back of the crowd, Mark stood quietly. No cameras pointed at him. No applause waiting. Just a man trying to understand what came next. Because this was no longer just Ayanna's fight. It belonged to all of them now. And the fire she lit wasn't one to burn it all down, but to force them to see what needed to be rebuilt. The days that followed the courthouse reckoning didn't bring immediate resolution, they brought aftermath. Heavy, layered, unpredictable aftermath. The city was buzzing in a different frequency now. Conversations shifted from protests and policies to reflection and reckoning. Ayanna's name, once just whispered among veterans and close neighbors, now hung in public discourse like a symbol people couldn't quite categorize. She had not demanded pity, nor rage, nor fame. What she had done was unmask something many knew was there but had grown too exhausted to keep naming. And now that it was visible, people had to decide what to do with it. In the police department, silence ruled. Meetings were tense, half the chairs empty. Officers who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Delaney were now grappling with their own images in the mirror, questioning what quiet compliance had cost them. Some resented Ayanna. Others respected her more than they could say out loud. And a few, just a few, began to speak up, breaking the invisible code of silence that had stitched their culture together for decades. Internal reviews were launched not by public demand, but by internal pressure from officers who no longer wanted to carry the weight of secrets they hadn't committed, but had allowed to thrive. Mark Delaney had not disappeared, nor had he attempted to reassert himself in any public sphere. Instead, he vanished into a silence that, for once, was not avoidance but confrontation. He had checked himself into a veterans trauma program 3 counties away, not out of strategy, but because he realized he was finally willing to ask himself the kind of questions that had once terrified him. What kind of man becomes the kind of officer who does what he did? What parts of him were shaped by fear, by arrogance, by years of unchallenged power? Could accountability exist without annihilation? And even if it could, did he deserve the chance to find out? Meanwhile, Ayanna continued moving with the same quiet intention that had always defined her. She didn't accept every invitation to speak, nor did she indulge the media frenzy trying to brand her as either a national hero or a polarizing figure. She chose her moments. She focused on policy meetings, on veteran support groups, on the small and difficult conversations that didn't make headlines but moved real change. She worked with a local task force to draft new procedures for law enforcement training, focusing on de-escalation, empathy, and post-traumatic response, not from theory, but from lived experience. When she spoke in those rooms, even the most hardened voices leaned forward. Because she wasn't preaching. She was remembering. At a closed-door summit held in the city's historic town library, Ayanna sat across from leaders from both police unions and community boards. It was an attempt at something few had dared to try before, genuine dialogue. The air was tense, not hostile, but thick with years of mistrust. One of the officers, an older black sergeant named Elijah Green, cleared his throat and looked directly at Ayanna. He said he'd been on the force 30 years and had seen more shifts in policy than most people had seen birthdays. But what he hadn't seen was someone like her, someone who didn't just call out the problem but stood in the fire of it without flinching. He asked her if she truly believed change was possible. Ayanna didn't answer right away. She looked at the room, let the silence stretch. Then she said that belief wasn't the right word. She didn't believe change was possible. She knew it was. Because she had seen men unmake themselves and rebuild. She had watched communities tear each other apart and then share meals across the same broken tables. She said change wasn't about speeches or policies. It was about stamina. The willingness to keep showing up even when the headlines fade. A younger officer across the table shifted uncomfortably. He raised his hand and asked if forgiveness was part of change. The question lingered in the room longer than expected. Ayanna looked at him, really looked, and then asked him back, forgiveness for who? For what? Because forgiveness isn't something we owe. It's something we give when we're ready. And readiness isn't a clock you can measure. It's a weight you learn to carry. That moment opened something in the room. People started talking less like officials and more like humans. Stories were shared. Not statistics, but stories. A black father whose son had been detained for walking home from school in a hoodie. A Latina officer who had joined the force to protect her community but often felt like she was betraying it from the inside. A white city clerk who admitted, with a voice full of shame, that he hadn't said a word during the protests because he didn't know how. Ayanna listened to each one. Not nodding in approval, not judging, but holding space. And that space, uncomfortable, messy, real, was where something finally began to shift. Outside those rooms, not everything was hopeful. There were angry voices, too. People who felt the punishment wasn't enough. Who believed Delaney should have faced jail time, not rehabilitation. Who accused the city of trying to save face by elevating Ayanna rather than dismantling the rot underneath. She heard them. She didn't ignore them. But she also knew that symbolic destruction often satisfied outrage more than it produced sustainable change. She wasn't here to burn it down. She was here to expose what needed to be rebuilt, and that required more than fire. In private moments, Ayanna struggled with her own questions. What did justice really mean in a system that never protected people like her? Was it enough to reform, or did it all need to be rebuilt from the ground up? And what did it cost her, emotionally, spiritually, to be the face of a battle she never volunteered for? One night, sitting on her porch with Noreen, they talked about the word closure. Ayanna said she hated it. That closure was a myth sold to people to make them feel like pain had an expiration date. Noreen sipped her tea and said that maybe closure wasn't the point. Maybe it was about reckoning. About truth. About letting the wound be seen, so it didn't fester in silence. That same week, the mayor's office offered Ayanna a permanent role in the city's Justice Reform Committee. A powerful seat. A title. Influence. She turned it down. Instead, she asked for funding to create a community-led response unit, a team trained in both medical emergency and conflict mediation, designed to respond where police presence only escalated things. She proposed it be staffed with veterans, social workers, trauma-informed professionals. She wanted it to be a blueprint, something that could be replicated in cities across the country. Not because she believed it would fix everything, but because it would be a start. Her request was granted. In another part of town, Mark Delaney, now months into his program, wrote a letter. It wasn't for publication. It wasn't for Ayanna. It was for his son. A boy he hadn't seen in nearly a year, too young to understand but old enough one day to ask. In the letter, he didn't excuse anything. He didn't write to defend himself. He wrote to explain how easy it is to get lost inside a uniform if no one ever holds you accountable. He wrote about fear, power, regret. And at the end, he wrote that real strength isn't in how many people you can command, but how deeply you're willing to be changed when someone confronts you with truth. The ripple effect was still moving. Ayanna saw it in small things. In a teenage boy at the grocery store nodding at her with eyes full of respect. In an elderly white woman at the bus stop who whispered, "Thank you," without needing to explain. In the anonymous note slid under her door that read, "I'm learning to see differently because of you." But she also knew the fight wasn't over. That the courtroom may have given a verdict, but the streets still carried wounds that legislation couldn't reach. And so, she kept walking. Kept showing up. Kept speaking not because she wanted to, but because she knew what silence cost. And somewhere, deep inside, she was preparing for one last move. A final act that would cement everything she stood for. Because what the world didn't know yet was that Ayanna had one more truth to reveal, one that would shatter the remaining illusions of what justice looks like when it finally comes from within. And when she was ready, they'd hear it. All of them. The air that morning carried a strange kind of stillness, the kind that lingered just before something shifted again. Ayanna sat on the edge of a folding chair in the community center she had helped repurpose with the city funds, the space that would now serve as the pilot location for her community response unit. Around her were a handful of new recruits, not in uniforms, but in jeans and plain shirts, their eyes fixed on her with a mixture of admiration and uncertainty. Some were young veterans, their postures rigid with discipline yet softened by the wear of experience. Others were civilian professionals, nurses, counselors, retired EMTs, each drawn by the possibility of reshaping how crisis and care could coexist in the same sentence. Ayanna looked around the room and felt the familiar ache in her chest, that burdened hope, the one that whispers maybe it's not too late to build something better. She stood and spoke to them the way she used to brief her team overseas, clear, grounded, real. She didn't recite a mission statement. She told them about the first time she saw a child freeze when a siren passed, how she recognized the same fear she'd seen in combat zones reflected in a 7-year-old's eyes on a sidewalk in Richmond. She told them this program wasn't about replacing police, nor was it about pretending one model could fix every failure. It was about being human first. Being present. Not with a weapon or a threat or a demand, but with a question, what do you need right now to feel safe? That's what this team was going to offer, presence over power, care over control. After the session, she stepped outside for air, her mind racing quietly. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Elijah Green, the veteran officer from the summit, leaning against the brick wall with 2 cups of coffee in hand. He handed her one without a word, and they stood in silence for a while, watching the slow movement of a city trying to remember how to breathe. He eventually broke the silence, his voice low. He said he'd spent 3 decades in the force, enforcing laws that sometimes didn't make sense even to him. That in all those years, he'd convinced himself the uniform gave him value, clarity, purpose. But seeing her, hearing her, watching what she did, it shook something loose. He admitted he had always feared what would happen if the system cracked, if the badge stopped meaning respect. But now he saw something else. Maybe the badge had to be earned every single day, not inherited by default. Ayanna didn't respond right away. She just took a slow sip of the coffee and then asked him a question that had been eating at her. If the very foundation of public trust had been built on silence and fear, how did they rebuild it with truth and presence without breaking the people who had depended on the old ways for their own survival? Elijah looked down for a moment and said that maybe some people wouldn't survive it, not as they were, but maybe that was the point. Maybe some parts of the old guard needed to be broken so something new could emerge. Later that week, Ayanna received a call she hadn't expected. It was Mark Delaney. Not calling to apologize again. Not calling to beg. Just calling because he said there was something he wanted to do, and he didn't know how to ask permission to do it. She hesitated before agreeing to meet him. Not out of fear, but out of caution, not for her safety, but for her spirit. They met in the back room of a small community church, one of those hidden spaces where the city's hardest conversations tended to unfold. Delaney looked thinner, not physically, but emotionally, like a man who'd been stripped down to his core. He sat with his hands folded, eyes not quite meeting hers at first. He said he'd been working with a veterans group, learning about accountability, not just as a concept but as a daily practice. He had also been speaking, privately, to young cadets entering the academy. Telling them the truth, about power, about blindness, about what happens when you let fear disguise itself as instinct. Ayanna listened, her expression unreadable. He continued, saying he knew nothing would ever undo what he'd done, but that maybe, just maybe, there was value in using his own collapse as a warning. A map of what not to do, how not to be. He said he wanted to speak at the public forum Ayanna was planning for the launch of the response unit. Not to center himself. Not to defend anything. Just to speak plainly, to name what went wrong, out loud, on record, in front of the people who had every right to hate him. The idea was uncomfortable. Complicated. Risky. Ayanna told him as much. She asked him why now, why at all. He looked at her finally, and his voice cracked as he said, because the worst part of this isn't what I did to you that day. It's knowing how many others I never even thought about. And maybe if they hear it from someone like me, they'll believe it's real. Maybe if they see me up there, not in a uniform, not hiding, maybe they'll realize the system can't protect them from the truth forever. Ayanna didn't give him an answer that day. She told him she'd think about it. That night, she met with Jamal and the core team coordinating the launch. She presented the idea, expecting pushback, expecting outrage. But instead, the room grew still. Jamal leaned forward and said that redemption wasn't a word people liked to hear when they were still grieving. But maybe it wasn't about redemption. Maybe it was about reflection. Showing people what it looks like when someone admits they were the problem and still chooses to stand in front of the fire they lit. The decision to let Delaney speak wasn't easy. It sparked debate. Tension. Division even among her supporters. But in the end, she said yes. Not because she trusted him. But because she trusted the people watching to decide for themselves. The day of the forum arrived under gray skies, as if the city itself understood the weight of the moment. The auditorium was packed. Not just with activists and officers, but with everyday citizens, families, students, elders. The room buzzed with a mix of suspicion and anticipation. Ayanna opened the event with a speech that was part manifesto, part prayer. She spoke of presence, of healing, of accountability. She spoke of the quiet warriors in the crowd, the teachers, the nurses, the parents who hold their communities together without ever being seen. And then, with a deep breath, she introduced the next speaker. Mark Delaney walked onto the stage alone. No notes. No escort. Just a man holding the weight of everything he used to represent. He began by acknowledging the discomfort in the room, saying he didn't deserve the microphone, didn't expect forgiveness, and wasn't here to clean his name. He was here because silence had protected him for too long, and he was ready to lose whatever was left of that protection. He recounted what he did, what he failed to see, how easily he dehumanized someone he didn't recognize, and how that wasn't an accident, it was the result of years of unchecked conditioning. He told them he wasn't exceptional, he was typical. And that was the problem. When he finished, no one clapped. No one booed either. Just silence. A heavy, breath-holding kind of silence. And then Ayanna returned to the stage. She didn't validate him. Didn't condemn him either. She said this moment wasn't about him. It was about what everyone did next. About how they carried this forward. She reminded them that systems don't change because people fall. They change because people rise. After the forum, as people filtered out slowly, many stayed behind in the courtyard. They didn't rush to debate. They stood in small circles, talking in low voices. A black mother spoke with a white teacher about fear. Two young activists exchanged numbers with a retired officer about volunteering in youth mentorship programs. Something had cracked open, not a solution, but a willingness. And as Ayanna stood at the edge of the crowd, watching them, she realized something had shifted in her too. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was carrying the weight alone. But she knew this wasn't the end. There was still one more thing she had to do. One more truth to face, not for the city, not for the cameras, but for herself. And when she did, it would be the final step towards something deeper than justice. It would be freedom. The night after the public forum, the weight of everything Ayanna had carried over the past months began to shift inside her in ways she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't a release, not yet, but a reorganization, like pieces of her soul that had been cracked apart by trauma were finally finding a way to settle back into something whole. She sat in her living room, lights dimmed, the warmth of tea cupped between her palms, but her mind wasn't in the room. It wandered to places it hadn't visited in years, to moments that defined her long before Richmond knew her name. The silence in the house felt different now, not hollow but sacred, as though even the walls understood that something had been endured, and something else was now beginning. Then came the message, a soft ping on her phone, almost insignificant in sound, but it carried a weight that changed the temperature of the room. It was from her older brother, Malik, who hadn't spoken to her in nearly 6 years. The message was short, I saw the speech. We need to talk. Tomorrow. Ayanna stared at the screen, her fingers trembling slightly over the keys. She typed, erased, typed again, and then simply replied, yes. Noon. My place. She didn't sleep much that night. Not from fear or stress, but from anticipation. Malik had been her anchor once. Older by 5 years, fiercely protective of her when they were young, especially during their teenage years when their father's temper would ricochet through the house like a loaded silence. But something broke between them after she enlisted. He had begged her not to go, said she'd be fighting for a country that never fought for them. She had told him she needed to get out, to survive, to prove something, not to them, but to herself. He had called it betrayal. She had called it purpose. And then came the silence between them that turned years into distance. The next morning was crisp, a rare chill rolling through the Richmond air. Ayanna cleaned her apartment even though it didn't need it, her body moving with nervous energy she hadn't felt since deployment. When the knock finally came, she took a moment to gather herself before opening the door. Malik stood there, taller than she remembered, older around the eyes, but still familiar in the way he tilted his head slightly before speaking, just like their mother used to do. He didn't speak right away. Neither did she. They stood in that quiet doorway, two siblings who had once shared bunk beds and now shared scars shaped by different wars. She stepped aside to let him in. He walked slowly, taking in the space, the bookshelves, the medals, the folded flag on the mantel. He paused in front of it, his voice low as he asked, "That his?" She nodded. Their father's service had been long and complicated. He had served with pride, returned with silence, and died with bitterness. Malik turned and faced her fully for the first time. His eyes were glassy but sharp. "You really did it," he said. "You made them look. Made them listen." Ayanna stayed quiet, unsure of how much she was ready to receive from him. But Malik stepped closer, his voice gaining weight. "I didn't want to watch it at first. I told myself I didn't care, that it was just another story the media would twist. But then I saw your face, Aya. And I saw you standing there like you were holding all of us, me, Mom, every damn kid who ever got shoved to the ground just for breathing, and I felt something shift." She swallowed hard, tears pressing at the corners of her eyes but refusing to fall. She asked him why it took him so long to come. His answer was simple, devastating in its honesty. "Because I was afraid," he said. "Afraid I'd be proud of you and still angry. Afraid you'd moved past me. Afraid I'd be too small next to everything you became." Ayanna took a deep breath and sat on the couch, motioning for him to join her. She told him that she never left him behind, that even when they didn't speak, she carried him with her into every mission, every room, every confrontation. She said he was the reason she knew what justice looked like, because he was the first one to teach her what injustice felt like. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. "I should have protected you better. I should have believed in your fight, even if I didn't understand it." She placed a hand over his, her grip steady. "You did protect me," she said. "When Dad got too loud. When school got too hard. When I couldn't breathe and you made me laugh. You showed me what love looks like when the world gives you nothing. That never left me." They sat in that silence for a long time, letting years of resentment melt into something softer. Then Malik asked her something she hadn't expected. "What now? You brought him down. You started a whole new system. People are watching you like you're the answer. So what now?" Ayanna leaned back, her gaze fixed on the ceiling like it held some unspoken truth. She said the hardest part wasn't exposing him, it was choosing what to do after. She said people think justice is a destination, but it's not. It's a decision you make every day, even when it's inconvenient, even when you're tired, even when no one is watching. She said she wasn't done, but she also wasn't going to let herself become a martyr. She wanted to build something sustainable, something that didn't need her face on it to survive. Malik nodded slowly and said maybe now was the time to rest, not stop, but rest. The next day, Ayanna went to the veterans center she had avoided for years. She walked in and was greeted by a woman named Denise who recognized her instantly, not from the news, but from a training they had done together years back. Denise embraced her tightly, and for the first time in months, Ayanna let herself be held. They talked about starting a new trauma support program specifically for veterans of color, people who had served but returned to communities that didn't recognize their sacrifice. Denise said it was long overdue. Ayanna said she was ready to help build it. Later that week, she stood in front of the city council one last time, presenting the final structure of the community response unit. She detailed its progress, its challenges, its victories. She requested that the leadership be passed to a team of younger professionals she had personally mentored, naming 2 women and 1 non-binary trauma therapist who had shown extraordinary skill and empathy. The council was surprised. One member asked her if she was stepping down. She said no, she was stepping aside. She ended the meeting by saying, "Leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about knowing when to make space for others. The system broke us in silence. We'll rebuild it in chorus." As she walked out of the chamber, she felt lighter. Not because the work was done, it would never truly be done, but because she had laid the foundation. And now, others could keep building. That night, back in her apartment, she opened a letter that had been sitting on her desk for days. It was from a young girl named Jada, who had attended the public forum with her mother. The letter was handwritten in careful block letters. It read, "Miss Ayanna, my mom says you are like Harriet Tubman but in sneakers. I want to be strong like you but also kind. Thank you for showing me both." Ayanna read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it gently, placed it inside her journal, and sat at her window, watching the city exhale under the weight of a long, hard season. In her chest, the storm had quieted. She was almost ready for the final step. Almost. Months passed, and Richmond was no longer the same city it had been when the story began. The streets didn't become perfect overnight, and the system still bore the scars of their history, but something had shifted, slowly, profoundly. The energy was different now. People spoke more openly in barbershops, in classrooms, at community dinners. There were hard conversations, sure, but there was also honesty, and with honesty came movement. The community response unit grew stronger, expanding into other neighborhoods and gaining national attention. Cities from across the country reached out to learn from the model Ayanna helped build, and her name started to appear in national forums not as a victim, but as an architect of reform. Not the centerpiece, but the blueprint. That mattered to her more than any medal. Ayanna's decision to step aside from leadership had created space for something deeper than power, legacy. The team she mentored flourished. The young non-binary therapist, Tay, took charge with grace and precision, bringing in culturally informed trauma care to areas long neglected. One of the women she trained, Desiree, had grown up only blocks away from the square where everything began. Now she was the lead responder in her own neighborhood, standing not as a symbol, but as proof that transformation doesn't always come from the outside, sometimes it grows from the roots that have been buried for too long. Ayanna herself found peace not in silence, but in intention. She returned to writing, something she hadn't done since before her deployments. She began drafting a book, not a memoir, but a guide, combining her military discipline with community experience, titled The Art of Holding the Line Without Drawing Blood. It wasn't about tactics, but about values, boundaries, presence, and the emotional labor of those who protect without armor. Publishers reached out, but she declined the big names. She wanted it published through a local black-owned press, and she wanted half of the proceeds to fund scholarships for young women pursuing careers in public service. One evening, she returned to the church where Mark Delaney had spoken, this time not for a forum, but for something more personal. The room was smaller, filled with veterans, faith leaders, and trauma survivors. Delaney stood at the back, no longer gaunt, but grounded. He had spent nearly a year volunteering anonymously at a shelter that Ayanna had referred him to, one that focused on reintegration for former law enforcement officers navigating shame and reform. He didn't speak in public anymore. That one time had been his act of exposure. Since then, he chose quiet accountability over redemption narratives. But on this night, he approached Ayanna at the end of the event and offered her something she never expected, a document listing the names of officers he had worked with who had privately reached out to him, asking for help. He told her, "They're scared. Not of punishment, of change. But some of them are ready to learn. If you'll have them." Ayanna took the list, glanced over it, and looked him in the eye. "We don't need perfect. We need honest," she said. "If they show up, we start there." Her brother Malik continued to show up in quiet ways. They rebuilt their relationship not through grand apologies, but through Sunday dinners, text messages, shared jokes, and the vulnerable work of relearning each other. Malik began mentoring young men at the community center, teaching art, storytelling, and critical thinking. He stopped being angry at the system and started using his voice to reimagine it. One afternoon, as they walked the same park trail they used to bike as kids, he told Ayanna he was proud of her, not just for surviving, but for choosing not to disappear into the pain. "You showed them what dignity looks like after the fire," he said. She didn't respond with words. She just reached out and held his hand. The final chapter of Ayanna's journey came quietly. No press. No cameras. Just her, standing in front of a classroom at a local college, speaking to students who had been born into a world where justice was more promise than practice. She told them the truth, that strength isn't the absence of fear but the choice to act despite it. That forgiveness isn't a gift you hand out, but a boundary you set when you're ready. That fighting for something bigger than yourself means learning when to speak, when to listen, and when to simply stand still and hold space for someone else's truth. One of the students asked her what kept her going, after everything. She smiled and said, "Because someone once held the line for me, even when I didn't know it. And now it's my turn." And just like that, her story turned into theirs. Now I want to speak directly to you, the one who stayed through every second of this story. What does justice mean to you? Is it punishment? Is it peace? Is it being seen, finally, after years of invisibility? What would you do if no one believed your pain? Would you rise anyway, like Ayanna did? Would you find a way to hold on to your humanity, even when the world demands your silence? This story wasn't just about a woman being wronged. It was about what happens when she refuses to disappear. When she turns her silence into a mirror for a system that forgot how to look at itself. So tell me, what are you willing to change? Who are you willing to become? If this story moved you, challenged you, or reminded you of something worth holding on to, I invite you to be part of more stories like this. Subscribe to Tales of Twist, where we don't just tell stories, we unravel them, reveal them, and rebuild them together. Until next time, keep questioning what justice looks like, and never stop listening for the twist that changes everything.